Hello, listeners. This is your host, Lance Ridgeland. We present to you Word Puppy's first album, Happy, Happy to the Right. The first segment of the album is author Paul David with his reading of The Abused Elf.
The Abused Elf. For all those nasty little season's greeters out there, this one's for you. Paul sat at his writing desk, staring from the 24-hour news websites on his laptop to the idiots next door hanging Christmas lights, glancing at his calendar on the wall, the one with all the black X's marking the days of misery. Paul saw that it wasn't even December yet. His large black X's stopped at November 24th, the day after Turkey Day, Black Friday. Black like the coal of his sinking holiday heart. The happy, crappy relatives had all jumped ship, left for Chicago, Indiana, somewhere in that dismal state, and New York. Thank the Lord for small favors, Paul thought, shifting his exhausted, bloodshot eyes from the calendar to the window with the happy neighbors stapling up their shiny, twinkling Christmas lights, the kind Paul hadn't seen since he was a kid. He remembered his old man taking him to the Graham's Five and Dime department store a week before Christmas to pick out cheap decorations to fill their dingy apartment. Since his mother passed away, there was only Paul and his father. He suppressed those memories and looked back at the neighbors. Happy newlyweds, Paul smirked, looking at the small framed picture of him and his wife, Candy, on the corner of his desk. Paul lifted the picture frame and thumbed off an inch of dust. Newlyweds, he whispered bitterly. Setting the frame back down, he clicked off the news sites and brought up his blank writing page. Like a piece of albino purgatory was that blank page. His agent, soon-to-be ex-agent, if he didn't publish soon, Mitch Conroy, knowing Paul's writer's block, suggested, with the festive time of year approaching, maybe his client might write a Christmas story. You know, the kind that those hacks like David Sedaris and Martin Short, or Steve Martin, publish in the New Yorker every so often. Mitch had said. Of course, old Mitch would never call these greats hacks to their faces. He'd just whisper it in the seedy corridors of the publishing biz. Fucking agents, Paul murmured. Taking a deep breath, Paul lifted his fingers over the keyboard and began to think. Christmas, fuck me. He couldn't think of a damn thing holiday-related. If there was any holiday spirit in Paul, it was little green guy who lived in the mountaintop, glowering down at all the happy who's down in Whoville. Glancing back out the window, Paul watched the young guy staple his finger. The neighbor howled, licking his wound, and then that sweet-cheeked young bride of his took her poor husband's bloody finger and kissed it. Paul saw their expressions change from happy holiday joy to mistletoe lust. Damn, he remembered when he and Candy used to feel that way. Hell, Paul remembered nights on the kitchen counter. No. He had to concentrate on the story. He needed to get his story written, at least the first draft, before jolly old Nick plopped down the chimney. That would be Mitch's Christmas present, a finished, hopefully publishable story wrapped in bright Christmas gift wrapper. But thinking on his writer's block, he didn't see what was happening. It wasn't going to happen. Looking back at the newlyweds, Paul shook his head bitterly. Fucking newlyweds, he scowled. Staring at the blank page, he clicked off the Word file and back at the news sites. Beep. Another breaking news article. Sexual abuse accusations in Hollywood. Again? Jesus, these execs are worse than Caligula, Paul said. He clicked the story. These types of sexual harassment stories seem to be popping up once every couple of days lately. Abuse of all kinds seemed to have slipped into the human consciousness as of late, like a perv with a rubber glove. These articles where Hollywood executives were forced where Hollywood executives were forcing kids to give blowjobs on the casting couch. This guy would be crucified in the media, and as far as Paul was concerned, rightly so. Ho, 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 Merry Christmas, pervs. You make a deal with the devil, and that red-ass prick always gets his due, Paul said as he finished the gruesome details of the executive's proclivities for boys. He couldn't believe what kind of details these sites were allowed to publish. All the news was fit to print, Paul figured, with a sinking feeling in his grinchy heart. Paul's eyes shifted back to the young couple again, and he saw the bride stapling images of happy, shiny elves on the side of the porch. Just like when I was a kid, Paul thought. The couple were so young, so naive, so innocent, just like the rosy-cheeked elf they stapled on the porch, just like Paul was once upon a time. Elves. Paul shook his head again bitterly. But then something miraculous happened. Call it a Christmas miracle. It was subtle at first. It was like, kind of like a ticking time bomb, just out of reach. What was it? Something about the innocent elf. Paul's eyes shifted back to the news article. Elves were small, like kids even, sexually abused in Hollywood. Elf, sexual abuse, Christmas, elf, Santa, elf, reindeer, elf, abuse. Paul's eyes narrowed like the Grinch. A dark, sardonic holiday grin creased his lips, and he clicked back on his blank word processor, staring back at him like a white landscape of snow with endless possibilities now, like the North Pole tucked away in all the bucolic, snowy shape places atop of the world. These thoughts were clearly a divine sign, and Paul thought he had a story. He typed 2 words at the top of the page. Abused elf. He read, cocked his head sideways. He tasted the title again. Abused elf. Abused elf. Didn't sound quite right. Got it, he said, adding the in front. The abused elf. Nice. As he so often did when he started a new story, Paul Googled images that might inspire him. Christmas images of Santa Claus with his fat, bulging belly and sack of goodies was always a fave. The parade of reindeer and skinny little elves hanging around that big fat man in his red suit just fueled Paul's perverted story ideas, like the Hollywood executives with their casting couches. Old Saint Nick had his reindeer games in the workshop. On the sleigh bench, bells jingled, ring-a-ding-ding-ding too. Yeah, dingling. The old perverted man in the red suit and his white beard. This story's gonna be the bitter generation's Christmas carol. This will be good. It's gonna be great. Mitchell loved this story, and so will all America. Hell, the world, Paul said, hammering away on the keyboard like a madman. Like a sugar plums dancing in his head, Paul's weird and twisted Christmas sex games were afoot at that snowy white workshop on the top of the world. Secluded, cozy. Wow, this story couldn't get any better, Paul thought. Like a weird sex cult in the middle of nowhere. When the bright, twinkling Christmas lights flashed across his vision from the newlyweds' front porch, many hours later, Paul paused in his typing. His fingers etched. They ached. He had hammered away for hours, his back strained. The light outside had vanished, replaced by darkness inside his writing room now. When had the lights gone out? The shine of the street lamp outside the window shone across his oriental rug. Jesus, what time is it? Paul yawned, pushing himself back in his chair, and felt a sharp, tingling pain shoot up his spine. Checking his wristwatch, he noticed that it was 7 p.m.? Paul tried to stand, but felt the pains of needles racing through his legs. Paul tried to stand, but it was too much. Ouch, 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 he called. Looking back at the computer screen filled with words, he grinned. This story was a Christmas miracle. He had written in such a day-long days and months. Hell, years. The flow state was there. Looking back at his computer screen, he noticed he had over 12,000 words. 12,000 words in a single sitting. That was unprecedented for Paul David. Nothing like this had ever happened for him in his entire writing life. He grinned. It's Miller time. Paul limped through the house in stocking feet to the kitchen where he popped a beer, guzzled the brew. He realized how thirsty he was and hungry. His stomach rumbled like wild hogs. Yeah, he could eat. Paul checked the fridge and the freezer. There was food, but nothing he wanted. Nothing that deserved to be eaten by a man back on the writing wagon. By God, a man who was spilling out his masterpiece like cum all over a face. Paul laughed, not having felt this good in years, when he noticed the small, dusty picture of his wife, Candy. The picture was stuck behind the magnet on the freezer door. He lifted the magnet, looked at his wife, her beautiful face. Candy's side of the bed hadn't been warm in months. Warming another man's bed, probably. Oh, knock it off, Paul. You know Candy never cheated on you. That happy feeling that his abused elf story had generated inside of him began to waver now. Wives, Paul grumbled. He snagged a second beer from the fridge and slammed the door. The nasty old Grinch expression crossed his face again, and he walked back across the house to his writing room. The room was once planned as a nursery, but as doorstep. Not sure if he was shooting blanks because Paul had refused to get checked. His ego wouldn't allow it. One thing led to another, hence the cold side of Candy's bed. Paul smirked. Their bedroom was across the hallway from the current writing room. He switched on both lights, but walked into the bedroom instead of his study. Most of Candy's pictures were turned over, dust collected on the backs. Paul wasn't sure why he had left the small picture frame with them in it on his writing desk, face up. Maybe because Candy hadn't left him while he was still working. The rest of the room had piles of neat, nearly forgotten kid stuff. Cribs still in their boxes. 2 paint buckets. Boy blue, pink lady. Looking at the remains of his once happy life, Paul felt that lump of coal in his chest. And again, it created the pain. He was so bitter. But then he thought, why not? Paul exited the past and walked into the writing room with his beer and sat down at the laptop again. He went back to his writing. No, not thinking, not plotting or planning, just writing. Writing for his life, actually. With the twinkling lights from the newlyweds next door, sometime during his blaze of typing, he must have asked Alexa for Christmas music, because holiday music was blasting through the compute speakers as Paul pounded away on the Christmas keys.
Well, by God, happy Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. It's that time of year again, children. That time of year where you ask your parents for something special, or if you're lucky and you've been a good little boy and girl, or, they ask you what you want this year. Well, and every street corner, we got the Merry Ho Ho Christmas Dingle Bells. That's right, the Dingle Bells. They go ho 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 in a jingle jingle jingle. Those little dingle bells, they're multifaceted. They do all kinds of stuff. Yep, but they're tricky. So make sure that you buy those dingle bells or get Santa Claus to deliver them under that Christmas tree this Christmas, because you're going to want some dingle bells. Trust me. Ho, 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 and a dingle, 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 dingle New Year, and a merry, merry Christmas to all.
Lance Ridgeland again, with a voice so rich, if you hear it, you'll feel real wealthy. We have another segment of our author reading his Abused Elf, Part 2. Sit back, relax, and enjoy.
How could they not see the brilliance of his story? His editor, his agent Mitch, even his wife Candy. They all supported him over the years when he was shoveling shit from a sitting position. But now that he had struck gold, they had backed off. Candy and Mitch told him to bury this sick, twisted tale about a small elf being gang raped by Santa Claus and his reindeer somewhere that no one would ever find it. They said the story wasn't part of the true spirit of Christmas. They said that it would warp the minds of kids who read it. Paul didn't disagree, but so what if his little abused elf story did warp the kids' minds? He didn't have any kids. If Paul didn't warp their innocent little minds, then someone else would. Someone was always looking to corrupt the innocents. It wasn't like Paul was some evil holiday spirit looking to ruin people's Christmas. So, when Paul pressed the publish on Kindle Direct website, the abused elf went to the Amazon self-publishing wing. He sat back with an open beer, his fifth actually, in his lap, proud as a new papa. If he had cigars, he would have smoked one. Looking around the quiet room, Paul sipped off his beer happily. His one true love, Candy, his agent Mitch Conroy, and whatever editor who was currently accepting his stories, they had all given up on him. Paul had had such high hopes for The Abused Elf. He saw the story reaching the top 10 on Amazon's Christmas genre list. He had vision. The rest of them, hell, the rest of them could get buried alive in a pile of yellow snow. Yeah, yellow snow, he belched. Screw 'em all, Paul whispered as the Christmas lights next door switched on again, twinkling with all kinds of holiday happiness. Paul winced at the beer. It had gone warm. When the email popped up on his computer from KDP, sometime later, he set the beer down and leaned forward. Yes! Paul grinned. The Abused Elf was accepted by the Amazon self-publishing behemoth. It would be published in 24 to 48 hours. Paul had purchased a cheap but professional Christmas cover off a British dude's website, published with KDP under pen names off and on in the past year, since his own name seemed to be made of mud in the publishing biz lately. Paul was still surprised when he received emails from his agent, Mitch. He clicked on the file for the Abused Elf cover. It had a joyful little elf on the cover, or half of an elf. The other half was sliding off the front page. Split personality. Fitting, Paul thought, since that poor little turd would be suffering psychological issues for the rest of his little elfy life. Standing up, Paul felt the alcohol slap him across the face. Paul looked out the window and saw snow falling. The first snow of the season. How perfect. Like a damn snow globe. Merry Christmas, world. I hope you like my gift. Like a frozen Christmas turd that is so emotionally hard that it resembles a lump of coal. Lump of coal? This frozen turd better turn into a diamond. Papa needs a brand new bag. The world did take notice of Paul's little turd coal. An 85-page story about sex and debauchery at the North Pole. Who wouldn't? Even the reindeer got into the action. A week after the story went live on KDP, it went up the bestsellers list with a bullet. Paul wasn't one to consider karma, but if he did, he may have noticed that for every 5-star review on Amazon, there were 2 1-star reviews. People posted threats, and they would boycott. Elfish size and look. When the abused elf became a top news story for the 24-hour cable stations, that's when Paul started to really digest his Grinchian tale. CNN and MSNBC had a series of blowhards talking about the negative psychological effects on children who read Paul's Christmas story. They made it seem like he single-handedly set out to ruin Christmas for the world. One cynical story, and the world came unglued. Was the story really that offensive? They wanted to string him up. What could he say? He'd been desperate. He needed an opening because all his previous doors had been slammed and locked. Candy had left him. Mitch Conroy would barely respond to his emails and forget about his calls. Even as the weeks leading to Christmas progressed, and Paul found himself booked on talk shows, podcasts, and magazine interviews about the breakout hit holiday story, now optioned by more film studios than he even knew existed, his wife still rejected him. Hey, Candy Cane, Paul left all sorts of drunken messages on his wife's cell phone. Candy refused his calls with a passion now. He must have left a few real doozies. In the past, Candy had always just considered Paul pathetic. Now it was world-ending, Christmas massacring Paul David asshole extraordinaire. He was on a plane flying back to New York from an interview at a national news station on the West Coast when Candy sent his last rejection email. Things were moving way too fast. He closed his eyes, removing his glasses, and rubbed them. Still bloodshot, still exhausted, Paul mused. The more things changed, the more they stayed the same. His bank account had grown, though. At least that was something, even if Candy wouldn't accept it. He could breathe a tad easier. Still, he missed his wife with a passion. His heart forgot stories like this all the time, right? But Christmas came around every year like clockwork. So Paul knew that despite removing the story, if that's what he chose to do, there would always be a place for him on that naughty list. Would you like a drink? Paul opened his eyes and saw a Christmas angel in front of him. An angel with blonde hair like a halo, tightly wrapped up atop her perfectly round head, perky lips, lifted bosoms, and the round rear said it all. God had to exist to create such a beautiful creature. Please, a beer, if you have it. Domestic or imported? She asked. Domestic, thanks, Paul said, noticing how the flight attendant had knelt next to him. He smelled her wonderful creamy aroma. Maybe it was because he was in first class. Maybe it was because this attendant was a Christmas angel. But Paul felt maybe when he got back to New York, he would see about pulling the abused elf from KDP. His heart felt a little like, well, perhaps it was finally thawing. Yes, he'd removed the little piece of coal that stirred up so much controversy. After all, he owned the copyright. Why not? Call it his own Christmas miracle to all the haters. As the flight attendant left to get the beer, Paul noticed an old woman in the seat across the aisle. The woman was watching a news program transmitted from the West Coast on her iPhone. When Paul's face flashed across the small monitor, he sat up proudly and watched the woman's reaction. The abused elf's cheap cover shone on the screen, and the old woman scowled, shaking her head. Disgraceful, she murmured. Paul felt the red flush of shame fill his features. He replaced his glasses and moved one seat over away from the old woman who was watching the newscast. Here you are, sir, the flight attendant said. But when she saw Paul had moved one seat over, she frowned. Sorry, Paul said, flushing. The blonde flight attendant popped the cap off the bottle and poured the beer, handing the frothy glass to Paul. He took a long swallow off the glass and moaned with pleasure. Boy, that's good. I needed that, Paul told her. The blonde paused, smiling at Paul. Hey, are you someone famous? The attendant asked, looking down at Paul. Paul blushed deeper and shrugged. I'm a writer, he said simply. Paul took another drink, so he didn't have to elaborate further on the fame. The angel attendant smiled, but when Paul didn't speak further, she exited back to coach. A writer, eh? A voice whispered from his left. Paul jumped. He hadn't noticed the old man with the corduroy jacket and the cotton beard sitting next to him on his left. Paul squinted at the old man. Do I know you? The old man squinted back at Paul. Placing a finger to his nose, he lifted off his airline seat. Paul sat mouth agape for a split second, believing that the stranger had actually levitated from his seat. When he glanced down, he noticed that the old man's feet were planted firmly on the ground, and he had lifted himself off the seat in a kind of magician's trick. Paul's awkward smile faltered, and he grinned. Ha! I could have sworn. Nice trick. Thank you. I'm a kind of a magician of sorts. The old man smiled beneath his cottony beard. The twinkle in his bright blue eyes charmed Paul. Now, what kind of a writer are you, my friend? Might I have read one of your books? Paul paused, looking around, and shrugged. I just mostly write short fiction. Had anything published? Yeah, many times. A couple of novels, even, Paul admitted. Hence first class, the old man said, motioning around them. Yes, my latest story sold like gangbusters. Hence, Paul motioned around, smiling. The old stranger chuckled like a bowl full of... Wait a minute. Paul looked back at the old man he had sworn hadn't been sitting there next to him a minute ago. The fluffy beard, the red corduroy jacket, the old style suit. The jacket looked almost Danish, or maybe like something you'd see in catalogs from someplace like Switzerland. And didn't the old elf have a kind of rustic accent, a regional voice that Paul couldn't quite place? Hey, where did you say you're from? I didn't. But if it matters, I am from a small village far north. Far north? Like maybe the North Pole, Paul thought, feeling less and less comfortable sitting next to this old stranger. You're a magician? What kind of a magician? Oh, the usual kind, the old man said, settling back in his seat. He looked across out the window at the dark sky. Winter solstice. Winter what? Solstice. The longest night of the year. December 21st. In olden times, we used to call the winter solstice the dark night of the soul, the old man said. I've heard of that term, Paul said, thinking back on the last 3 weeks. Since he pressed publish through KDP, his life had been swept up in a whirlwind of excitement, money, fame, and resentment. Death threats were new to Paul, but he was taking them with a grain of salt. Like the sands of time, this too would pass. Then his eyes shifted to the old man in the red corduroy jacket. The dark expression on the stranger's twinkling eyes frightened Paul, like coal maybe. Looking around, he noticed that the light of the interior of the plane seemed to dim suddenly. Paul looked back out the window as he whispered, Winter solstice. Dark night of the soul. A chill raced through him. Death threats. His story about the poor abused elf had angered many parents. There were crazies out there. Another chill raced up his spine. Paul turned back to the old man, hoping to maybe pass a joke or 3, but the stranger was snoring softly. The rhythm of his snores was comforting. So comforting, in fact, that Paul too found himself drowsing, where just a moment ago he was wide awake, staring out the blackened window. Looking at the old man in the red corduroy jacket, Paul thought, he's putting a spell on me. I know it. He really is magic. Paul yawned and stretched, trying desperately to stay awake, but it was no use. The spell had been cast, and he fell, tumbled like a snowball down a wintry hill, collecting more and more snow, or in Paul's case, more dreams as he went.
Tinseltown, Tinseltown, tinsel all the way. Oh, fuck. Well, we don't buy tinsel here anymore. We don't sell it. People don't buy tinsel. They don't. Tinsel is depressing. It just sits on a Christmas tree like garbage. A Christmas tree with tinsel on it looks like a heap of garbage. You might have a glowing Christmas star or an angel atop that pine tree, but once you put tinsel on it, once you put tinsel on that beautiful magic relic, you turn it into hell. Tinsel catches fire. Tinsel looks like ice, but it's not ice. It's fraudulent. Tinsel. 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 Who created tinsel? Who created tinsel? Why does tinsel exist? Some people call tinsel tensile. It's got a tensile strength to it. No, it doesn't. Tinsel is shitzel. Shitzel is what they should have called it, not tinsel. Shitzel. Shitzel. Shitzel, 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 shitzel. Do-do-do-do-do. Shitzel instead of tinsel. Shitzel, 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 shitzel. So don't buy tinsel, because tinsel is shitzel, and it will make your Christmas tree burn up, and it is shit.
Lance Ridgeland here, and I'm back with a presentation of The Abused Elf Part 3 by Paul David. Enjoy.
A boy stood alone in red long johns, staring into the pitch black of the night sky. The window began to fog up because of the boy's desperate breath on the glass. The Star of David shone down like a spotlight over the yard of the boy's tenement. All other stars were invisible in the presence of the Christmas star. Most of the other apartment windows were dark. The boy counted 4 of the 12 windows across the yard with Christmas lights. He and his father had taped up twinkling red, green, and blue lights around their small window. A strap of lights said, "Come loose." There was no tree in the living room, but his old man had found a couple of clean wool socks he had fashioned as stockings. Those stockings were nailed to the liquor cabinet. The boy was missing his mother. She had died 1 year ago this very night. Drunken driver. The old man was asleep on the sprung plaid couch behind him. A bottle of whiskey lay on its empty side next to the couch. The boy paid his father no mind. The boy had tears in his eyes. He was praying for his mother's return. Santa could do that for him, couldn't he? Sure he could. Santa was a magical, and boy, this time of year, it was all magical. Christmas time, and all prayers said with true heart would be granted. All the story said so. Paul just knew it would work. It had to. The boy knelt at the frozen window all night, hands clasped, lips pressed together with prayers. In the morning, when his father awoke to find his son nearly delirious from the iced-over cold coming from the uninsulated windowsill, Paul's father had run his son a warm bath and bathed him, washing away all the boy's tears. Another Christmas, many years later, but still a boy, now 15, drinking rot-gut liquor from a stolen whiskey bottle in a forsaken dumpster. Paul and his best bud, Walter Grimm, exchanged the bottle and a bag of day-old donuts from the local gas pump joint on the corner. They were buried in discarded colorful Christmas present wrappings. Paul took one of those brightly colored papers and rolled a fat joint, tapping it with a moronic giggle. Yeah, this was gonna be one chill Christmas Eve. He laid back with one hand behind his head, a joint in one hand, and a bottle of whiskey passed back and forth with his best bud. Life didn't get any better. Right? Another Christmas. Candy Cane. Boy, she was gorgeous. An knockout with her blonde hair and green eyes, lips that looked like cherries ripe for the kissing. Paul's first real love. Yeah, life could only get richer. Wedding day, flowers in bloom, friends and his old man standing off in the crowd of well-wishers. Paul thought he saw his father take a swig off a flask. No matter, the day was bright, and he was wearing the ring of his betrothed. Candy, with her blonde hair wrapped up on top her head like an angel and her halo. Wow. Now alone with only his glowing computer screen, the old manual typewriter, the machine that he started with, sits on the floor opposite his wooden desk. A single glowing green lamp sits at his right, illuminating the new keyboard. Candy, watching her husband, who is transfixed inside his fantasy world, breathing heavy. When Paul wrote back in those days, he could become totally entranced by his imagination. Like a deep sleeper who isn't roused by an alarm, Paul would write for hours in the flow state. That was when he was selling constantly a lonely reality for a wife, always second place. Another holiday season in the marriage counselor's office, Paul feeling like he could use a drink, feeling like he was in the principal's office, 2 comfortable chairs, he and Candy sitting next to each other, facing a female shrink. The memory shows no face now for the shrink. She had a mole, though. Paul was sure of it. Paul itching to get back to the word processor and the whiskey flask. Storylines revolving in his brain. Alcohol was the only thing to untie the knots in his mind. Thoughts racing mile a minute. Watching the shrink talking and then turning to the candy, hearing one word and only one word on her voice. Baby. Not happening. Was she shooting blanks? And no baby, he heard himself say. Deep in his consciousness, his black heart sank at Candy's tears. His life flashed before his eyes. What next? Paul saw himself in an empty apartment, lights out except for the flashing Christmas lights shining in through the open window, lights cast by a neighbor's holiday joy. The drunken bitterness in Paul's features made the writer watching from outside ashamed. Hindsight is 20/20, Paul sniffled, thinking about that poor abused elf. How could he have done that to the Christmas magic, miracles? This time of year, there were miracles, and then there were Grinches. Damn it, why? Why did he have to be so damn mean, so damn bitter, like a piece of coal? That cover, the cover he bought online, was all bright red and green, holiday colors. That cover was a con job. Lure the foolhardily in with childish cover, only to be sucker punched with the horrific events of the North Pole. We'll be making our descent into the Schenectady County Airport in 5 minutes. A voice echoed still in the twilight time of Paul's dream. Where was he? He was on a plane, flying back from California to New York. Just another stupid interview session. Dreams. Nightmares, Paul whispered, wiping tears from his burning eyes. He wanted a drink. Suddenly, the image of a devastated children holding a small paperback version of his story, the abused elf, blasted into his mind. Paul shook. The horrible reviews flashed through his vision as he glanced back out the window. Now the blackness that had filled that round glass orb was replaced by mountains of snow, twinkling lights of the city below, a drop-off at the Schenectady airport, and then 2-hour drive north to Denmark, where he could barricade himself away from the world and drink? Rubbing his dry lips, he glanced aside to see a vacant seat where the old man in the red corduroy jacket and the pillowy beard had been when Paul fell asleep. Twisting off the cap, he drank half the bottle in a single gulp. Boy, that was good. Spring water. Paul rubbed his lips again, tentatively, lifting the card off the empty seat. Turning the card over, he saw his name scrawled in spidery calligraphy on the back in red ink. A gift from that stranger in the white beard and red coat? Paul felt all alive with a good cheer. He would be descending in a few minutes, landing safely at the Schenectady airport, and then he would be home in a couple of hours, weather permitting. As Paul slid a finger under the card tab and ran that finger under the rough paper, he winced. Shit! Paper cut. Paul slid his bloody index finger into his mouth and sucked. Removing the card from the envelope, Paul turned it over. Staring up at him was the cover of his story. The cover with the half-elf staring at him in colorful Christmas reds and greens. Paul's brow narrowed as he opened the card. A single phrase was scrawled in red spidery cursive. A Christmas miracle? Paul read. Suddenly the plane jumped. Paul looked all around him in fear. The other passengers jostled uncomfortably. Another jump and shimmy as the plane hit turbulence. An ice pocket. Someone over the loudspeaker was saying something More frantic cries from the passengers. Paul opened the blind of the window. He saw the last pair of hoofs with the ring of the jingle bells vanish into the falling snow with his plane struck another massive ice packet or pocket. Someone was desperately trying to sound calm over the loudspeaker, but failing successfully. More shaking, Paul frantically glanced out the window again and could barely see the silhouette of a sleigh and 8 tiny reindeers. Glancing back down at the card, Paul whispered, "A Christmas miracle?" When the plane engine stopped and the systems failed, the plane dropped like a bag full of used coal. Paul had only seconds to contemplate that card before the planes impacted on the field beyond the airport runway, engulfed the passengers in flames. Epilogue. Well, Kathy, some might say a Christmas miracle. Oh, Dan, that's horrible. Kathy laughed, lifting her mug of hot chocolate to her Botex lips. Horrible indeed, but only for the passenger who didn't survive. The author of that controversial story, The Abused Elf, Dan remarked with distaste, died in a plane crash this evening en route from California to New York. While arriving at the Schenectady County Airport, flight 1225 crashed down due to frozen fuselage, Dan said. Nearly all passengers survived. A Christmas miracle if there ever was one. Indeed, Kathy. And not to speak ill of the dead, but some parents of those children read Mr. Paul David's The Abused Elf. Well, some of those parents, they might be feeling a little Christmas miracle going on right now. Horrible but true, Dan. Now, for all those holiday shoppers out there,
Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. It's that time of year again. Snow's falling. I'm seeing people with their trees on the top of their cars. You know what that means. It means time for family, time for dinners, time for presents, time for anxiety, time for stress, time for depression, time for alcoholism, time for it all. But you know what? There's a solution. Cannabis Larry's. Cannabis Larry. Yeah. Cannabis Larry, just dial 555-555-55555 and you can get the best cannabis on any single pole of this entire universe. That's right, Cannabis Larry. 555-555-55555 and you will be rocking the holiday just like the big fat man in the big red fat suit and that big fat sleigh with those big fat reindeer and that big fat bitch at night that he bangs the fuck out of. He bangs the fuck out of that Miss Piggy. Yeah, Miss Piggy. Fuck that Piggy. Fuck her. Fuck. Cannabis Larry. There ain't nothing like it. Woo! Happy holidays and a happy new fucking year! Woohoo!
Now, the Twistmas star. Here. Have a wink. And this brings to our conclusion our Christmas story. Good night, and always remember, happy to the right, keep to the right. Ja, anders, anfrenzer.